Welcome to a new Masechta of On the Same Page. I am Rabbi Hillel Shaps, and I will be your chavrusa, if you'll be learning through the audio and video option for On the Same Page. Very excited to be learning Maseches Kiddushin with you. As always, if you have any questions, you want to discuss anything, feel free to reach out, email me, respond to the On the Same Page email, and then we can be chavrusas and learn together. So we're going to be learning Maseches Kiddushin. Maseches Kiddushin deals with Kiddushin. Kiddushin is a betrothal, a sanctification of a woman to a man. In Jewish law and halacha, there are two steps to a marriage. There's first the Kiddushin, the betrothal, and then later the nisuin, which is the completion of the marriage. And there's different opinions as to what exactly is required to consummate, to complete a marriage. But the first step is the Kiddushin. Now, typically, in the old days, these two things would be done separately, and they would do the Kiddushin, the betrothal, and then the wife would, or the engaged woman would return home, and then the marriage would be sometime later, often a year later. But nowadays, we do it both at the wedding itself. So nowadays, an engagement has no real halachic significance, or very limited, at least, besides for some commitment, but there's no actual Kiddushin betrothal that takes place at the time that somebody says, will you marry me? But at the wedding itself, under the chuppah, that's where we actually have the Kiddushin, where the husband says, Hareyat mikudeshes li, you'll be sanctified to me, and he gives her something, gives her a ring, and that's the Kiddushin. And at the same time, we also have the nisuin, the marriage. So we have the chuppah, which is one opinion of how you consummate, complete a marriage, and we have the yichud room where they seclude themselves for a few minutes. But this Masechta deals primarily with Kiddushin, and the difference between Kiddushin and nisuin, these two stages, there are differences. The main difference that sort of can collectively describe the differences is that Kiddushin is primarily just a designation or a designation, a sanctification of the woman to be this man's wife, and she is now prohibited from marrying anyone else without receiving a divorce, a get, a divorce document already from the time of Kiddushin. But at this point, they aren't yet living together. They don't have any obligations to each other in terms of the regular, day-to-day life of a husband and wife and the requirements that come with that. That only happens once they are nisuin, once they have the actual marriage. And there's actually many different implications of this, which some of them we'll probably touch on when we learn the Masechta. Some of them we won't get to. You'll have to learn Maseches Ksubos maybe to learn about others. But here we're dealing with Kiddushin. This Masechta, the main topic, as the name of the Masechta describes, is Kiddushin, is betrothals. But as we'll learn in this first chapter, first of all, you should know this first chapter is the longest chapter in Shas. In the entire Talmud, the first chapter of Kiddushin, it goes, I think, 41 pages. So this very first chapter, we're in for a long one. And the first chapter starts off dealing with Kiddushin and the way that's affected, how a betrothal works. But once, as we'll see, it's similar to a transaction, and therefore once it's discussing transactions, it gets to the topic of transactions in other circumstances as well. And there's certain later Mishnayos in this chapter that talk about different types of acquisitions and transactions, and then in the later chapters, the second and third and fourth, it comes back more to the topic of Kiddushin. But the truth is that the first many pages, they do center around Kiddushin, and then we get into some other interesting topics that are less related to Kiddushin. So here we go. So just for those who are new to Gemara study, to Talmud study, I'll just give the quick rundown. So if you're looking at a Vilna Shas page of Gemara, so in the middle you have the Gemara, so it always starts with the Mishnah, and the Mishnah was the first recording of the oral Torah, and then later they recorded more, and that's the elaboration of the Talmud, of the Gemara, on the Mishnah. So it starts with the Mishnah, and then in the same area it goes into the Gemara, and then always on the inside column is the commentary of Rashi, which is like a running commentary, explaining each step of the Gemara, and on the outside you always have Tosfos, which was some other medieval commentaries. Many of them were actually Rashi's. There's different authors of Tosfos. Among them are Rashi's grandchildren, and Tosfos usually will compare this Gemara with other Gemaras and try to figure out how they can jive, how to reconcile different contradictions, and also sometimes just asks, questions and tries to explain the reasoning and approach of the Gemara. So we're going to start the Mishnah. The Mishnah begins, Ha'isha niknis b'shalosh drachim. A woman is acquired to a man in 3 ways. V'kones atzma b'shtei drachim, and acquires herself back in 2 ways. So we are using a word acquisition. It's not that a husband owns his wife, she's not the property of his, but the method through which he consecrates her, he sanctifies her, he's mekadesh her, is through similar to a monetary transaction, and in a sense she is acquired to him in that now she, just like when you acquire something, it's now yours and not anybody else's. So the same way when a husband acquires a wife, so she is now his and she's forbidden to anyone else. Well, we wouldn't say that the other way around, because according to Torah law, a man is allowed to have more than one wife. So she doesn't acquire him because he can still marry someone else according to Torah law. Now, later there's Takanas Rabbeinu Gershom, where that's now forbidden, at least in Ashkenazic communities and many Sephardi communities as well. But again, according to Torah law, a husband could have more than one wife, so he's not acquired to her, but she is acquired to him. She's now prohibited to to all other men in the world. And we'll see that there's going to be a discussion about this language, acquisition, versus what we're talking about, Kiddushin, to be mekadesh, to sanctify. We'll get into that in the Gemara, but the first language we see here is Ha'isha niknis, a woman is acquired in 3 ways. V'kones atzma b'shtei drachim, and she acquires herself back in 2 ways, that she would now be permitted to marry others. There's 2 ways. Niknis b'kesef b'shtar uvabiyah. The 3 ways that she's acquired by her husband is with money. He gives her money, or something that's equal to money, which is what we do, right? We give a ring. It has monetary value. That's the Kiddushin. The man gives her a ring to acquire her. B'shtar, with a document. Uvabiyah, or with sexual intercourse, which is not practiced, and later the Gemara is going to say that one is not supposed to actually do that, but technically it could work as the act of Kiddushin, of sanctification. So we should just point out that when he gives her kesef, when he gives her money to sanctify her, so Rashi tells us that he gives it to her, and he says, Harei at mikudeshes li, right? You are sanctified to me through this money. That's what we do nowadays. When we give the ring, we say those words under the chuppah. Bishtar, you can also do what we said with a document. Rashi explains that you write on the document those words. You write on the document, and it doesn't matter how much the document is worth. It just has to be a piece of paper, and on it is written Harei mikudeshes li, and that also can work. And the 3rd way, through intercourse, also Rashi says that you have to declare that that's for the purpose of Kiddushin, and he has to say that Hiskad shili b'biyazu, you should be sanctified to me through this biyah, through this intercourse, in order for it to work for Kiddushin. Now the Mishnah discusses how much kesef, how much money do you have to give for Kiddushin. So Beis Shammai omrim b'dinar u'b'shava dinar. Beis Shammai says you have to give a dinar, or something that's equal to a dinar. A dinar is a monetary value from back in the day. I couldn't tell you exactly what it is, but it's more than what we do, because we follow the next opinion, which is Beis Hillel omrim. Beis Hillel says the pruta v'shava pruta. You only need a pruta, which is a very small amount. Now, what we actually do is usually give a ring, which is much more than either a dinar or a pruta, but technically you could get away with just giving a pruta, a very small monetary amount, and probably, maybe, 5 or 10 cents, I would think. It's totally a guess, but a small amount, and that could do the trick. Or shava pruta, or something that's equal to that. It doesn't have to be money, it could be something equal to money, that's worth something. And kama hi pruta, how much is a pruta? The Mishnah asks, I guess they want something to compare it to. Echad mishmona b'isar italki. It's 1/8 of an Italian isar, a certain coin which was known to them. An Italian isar, a Roman coin of some sort, and the pruta is 1/8 of that coin. And pruta, Rashi tells us, is generally a copper coin. So it just has to be worth a pruta, a very small amount, which is 1/8 of a Italian isar. And those are the ways. That's how a man acquires a wife, with kesef, through money or something that's worth something. The kones atzma, the Mishnah continues, and she acquires herself back. There's 2 ways. The get, through a divorce document. If the husband gives her a bill of divorce, a get, then she is now back on her own. She's now permitted to the rest of the world. Uvamisa sabal, or if the husband dies, also she reacquires herself in that she's now permitted to the rest of the world. Hayavama niknes bebia dekones atzma bechalita v'misa sayavam. A yavama is a woman who was married and they had no children. So according to Torah law, when a husband dies without children, the wife is supposed to marry, or is designated to marry, one of the husband's brothers to continue on the husband's name. And they have the option to either do yibum or chalitza. Yibum is where the brother actually marries the wife who has no children, or chalitza is the process through which they choose not to be married. So a yavama, if he wants to marry her, if he's going to marry her, how does he marry her? It's bibia. There's no kiddushin, at least not according to Torah law. There's no sort of kiddushin then, or you can't do kesef or shtar according to the Torah. There's no money or document. If a man dies without children and the brother is going to be miyabim, to marry the wife, then it's done according to the Torah, through bia, just through intercourse, and then they're married. V'kones atzma b'chalitza uv'misa sayavam. And she, in this case, would acquire herself back if they haven't done yibum, then either through chalitza, which is the process of a yavam choosing not to marry the woman, and the other way is through misa sayavam, through the death of the yavam, of this brother. If he dies before marrying her, then or even I guess after marrying her, either way, she would now become free to the world. She would that also. That's another way that she acquires herself. So there's a lot going on in this Mishnah. We have a talk about different ways that the woman how a woman is acquired to her husband, how a woman then acquires herself back, and also how a yavama, a woman who falls to yibum, how she becomes married to her husband, to the yavam, or how she reacquires herself. So the first Gemara is actually going to be dealing with a lot of the language of the Mishnah. So the Gemara says as follows: Ha'isha niknis, right? We said that a woman is acquired, and he used this term niknis, acquired, kinyan. Ma'ishna hacha detani ha'isha niknis, u'ma'ishna hasam detani ha'ish mekadesh. The Gemara asks, why is it that over here we use a language of ha'isha niknis, a woman is acquired, and why is it different over there at the beginning of the second chapter, where it uses a language of ha'ish mekadesh? That's our first introduction. It may not be the first. I think it is introduction to the language of Kiddushin, and that's the first Mishnah of the second chapter, of the second parak on Mem Aleph, Hamad Aleph, 41a, which begins ha'ish mekadesh. The man sanctifies his wife. It says on his own or with a messenger, but already it's talking about the same act, but instead of saying that the man acquires her, it says that he sanctifies her. And over here, instead of saying that she becomes sanctified, she becomes designated, it says that she becomes acquired. So the Gemara wants to know, why do we change the terminology from kinyan to kiddushin in the second chapter? Or maybe more specifically, why in this chapter are we using the word kinyan, we're using niknus and not using the word kiddushin? So the Gemara explains, Mishum, because dekabayu lemisni kesef. Because we want to teach you that one of the methods is kesef, is through money, through giving money. And as we're going to explain, that when you're talking about money, so then the source for using money is the idea that this is a transaction, it's a kinyan. And that's how you know that you're allowed to use money. As the Gemara explains, the kesef min alang, and how do we know that we're allowed to use money? And actually, Rashi says that the Gemara really, in a way, is not asking this over here. The Gemara is going to ask this question later. How do we know that you're allowed to use money? And so the discussion, in a sense, is really happening later. It's just quoting the discussion that it's going to bring later. So we want to talk about kesef. And by the way, we're going to ask later, kesef min alang, how do we know that you're allowed to use kesef, that you're allowed to do kiddushin using money? And it's going to explain as follows. Gamar kicha mistei Ephron. We learn a gezerah shava. The gezerah shava is when you have two of the same word in two different places. So if there's a tradition, you need a tradition for a gezerah shava, but when we have a tradition, we can compare and learn from one place to the other. So we have a tradition to learn a gezerah shava where it says the word kicha uses that root, kach, take, in two different places, and we have a tradition that we're supposed to learn one from the other. And the place that we learn from is Stay Ephron, the field of Ephron, which is actually coming up in I guess if you're watching this after Sunday, so it's coming up in this week's Parsha, in Parshas Chaye Sarah. So there we have that Avraham Avinu buys a field from Ephron, Hachiti, and there it uses the word kach, as we'll see in a moment. So it says ksiv hacha. It says with regards to marriage, with regards to a man taking a wife, it says ki kach ish isha, when a man will take a wife, and it uses the word kach, that you take. And how do you take a wife? How does that happen? Uksiv hasam, and it says over there by Avraham buying the field from Ephron, it says nasati kesef hasadeh. I've given the money, the kesef, the silver, for the field. Kach mimani, take it from me. So it uses the word kach, that root, in the context of a transaction over there. And so we can learn one from the other. Just like over there, the kach, the taking of the field, was with money. So too, even though in the verse, actually, the word kach is referring to take the money, not take the field, but Tosfos explains, but we can still learn from it because it's a gezerah shava. It's just saying in this context, it uses the word kach with regards to money, to kesef, and so too when it uses the word kach, to take, by a man and a woman, it also can be with kesef, with money. V'kicha ikri kinyan. And we also find that taking with money is called a kinyan, is called an acquisition. Dirsev, because the verse says over there, in that context it says, Hasadeh asher kana Avraham, the field that Avraham acquired. So when Avraham gives money, he acquires a field. There's a kicha that goes on over there, there's a taking, and that taking is called an acquisition. And so too, the taking of a wife to a man, which also uses the word kach, taking, is also an acquisition. Or, inami, the Gemara says on the top of the next page, alternatively another verse where we see that taking a field is called an acquisition. It's a verse in Yirmiyah, where it says, Sados bakesef yiknu, fields with kesef, with money you will acquire. We see that taking a field is called an acquisition. So too, the taking of a wife is also an acquisition. So that's why, explains the Gemara, Tani ha'isha niknis. That's why the Mishnah used the terminology that a isha is niknis, a woman is acquired, because because we wanted to teach about how Kiddushin takes place, which is with kesef. And what's the source that kesef works? It's from taking the field of, where Avram takes a field with kesef, and that's called an acquisition. So therefore, the fitting term when you're discussing acquiring something with kesef would be to use the word kinyan, the word niknus. And that's why our Mishnah used the word ha'isha niknus as opposed to later on where it used the word ha'ish mekadesh, the man sanctifies. Now, so fine, very nice, but let's ask the question the other way. V'nisni hasam ha'ish koneh. So if you like the word acquisition so much, so why not in the second chapter say ha'ish koneh when it's talking from the man's perspective of how he acquires his wife? So don't say he sanctifies her, he's mekadesh her. Say ha'ish koneh, a man acquires. Why does it say ha'ish mekadesh, he sanctifies her? So the Gemara explains, you know why? Because meikara tani lishna de'oraisa. First, over here, we're using the language that the Torah uses. In other words, the Torah uses the word ki'ikach. It says to take. It's like an acquisition. That's the language the Torah uses. Ula b'sof tani lishna derabanan. And later, in the next chapter, we're using the language that the Rabbanan use, that the sages use, which is Kiddushin, which is Mekadesh. And that's why it switched. And there's something to be learned. They wanted to, I guess, teach you something by using that language. Umay lishna derabanan, and what is this language supposed to imply? Why do the rabbis use the language of mekadesh, to sanctify, to be mekadesh? So the answer is de asar la akuli alma kehektish. That what it's teaching you is that she becomes forbidden on the rest of the world like hektish. Hektish is when you designate and sanctify something for temple use, so nobody's allowed to use it anymore. It's designated for the temple. So similarly, when a husband sanctifies his mekadesh, his wife, when he acquires his wife with Kiddushin, so he sanctifies her in that she is now forbidden to the rest of the world like hektish. And that's what the sages wanted to bring out in using the terminology of Kiddushin or ha'ish mekadesh, the man sanctifies his wife. So, further examining the language, we notice that here it says ha'isha niknus, a woman is acquired, and it's talking from the woman's perspective. Later, it's talking from the man's perspective. Ha'ish mekadesh, the man sanctifies her. So the Gemara asks, v'nisni hacha ha'ish koneh. Let it say here the same as it says there, that a man is koneh. He acquires his wife in three ways. Why does it say the wife is acquired in three ways? So the Gemara explains, mishum dikabayu lemisna seifa, because it wanted to teach the second part of the Mishnah. And the second part of the Mishnah says, B'kona es atzma bidida. B'kona es atzma, that it taught the ways that she acquires herself back. And that's bidida. That's talking about her, from her perspective. So, Tanganami Reisha bidida. Since the second part of the Mishnah, when it talks about acquiring herself back, is talking about her, so from the very beginning, just to stay consistent, we spoke about it from her perspective, how she has acquired her husband, and then how she acquires herself. So the Gemara asks, well, why in the second half are we talking about from her perspective? In Nisni, let it say, ha'ish koneh umakneh. Just say, the man acquires his wife in three ways, and is makneh her, and sort of releases her, and sells her, not sell literally, but makneh, transacts her back to herself in two ways. Why does it use the language that, why is it centering around the wife's perspective? Let it be consistent with what we have in the second chapter and talk about it from the husband's perspective. He acquires her in three ways, and he relinquishes that in two ways. So the Gemara explains, Mishum de'ika misa sabal, because one of the two ways that he relinquishes is through his death. Delaviu kamakni. That's not him relinquishing. That's not him being makne her, transacting her back to herself. Min shemayahu demaknila. That's the heavens taking his life and being makne her to her. So it and I guess he's not around for to really talk about him being involved in that transaction. He just died. It's true when he gives a get, when he gives a document of divorce. So fine, that is him. Relinquishing ownership. But when he dies, that's not really him relinquishing ownership. So therefore, it talks about it from her perspective, where she acquires herself by accepting the get, and she also acquires herself, again, it's still the heavens doing it, but I suppose since she's there to she's still alive, to receive herself back to herself, So therefore, it's fitting to talk about it from her perspective. And once we're talking about her perspective for the second part of the Mishnah, of her acquiring herself back, so it spoke about it from her perspective from the beginning of the Mishnah, where she becomes acquired to the husband. Alternatively, another reason why it didn't say that the husband acquires the wife, because itana kona, if it had said he ha'ish kona, instead of saying ha'isha niknes, instead of saying the woman acquires herself, if it had said that he acquires her, hava amina filu bal karcha, I would have thought he can acquire her even by force. Like if it said he acquires her, I would have thought that it's totally up to him, and she doesn't have a say in it. Tana, therefore the Mishnah made sure to say ha'isha niknes, that she is acquired demidaita in shalom midaita lo, to teach me that she has to be willing, she has to agree to become acquired, to become miskadeshes, to become engaged or betrothed or sanctified. She has to need her agreement. Shalom midaita lo, but without her agreement it doesn't work. A man cannot be mekadesh, cannot sanctify a woman without her agreement. Therefore, it didn't say ha'ish kona, the man acquires, which may sound like he can do that bal karcha without her agreement. It said she becomes acquired only with her agreement. Now the Gemara asks another linguistic question. Umay irya ditani shalosh. Why did the Mishnah say that she is acquired in 3 ways, but the shalosh is masculine? It's feminine. Lisni shlosha. Let it say shlosha, which is masculine. It's a little counterintuitive, but in Hebrew, usually when you add a hey, it becomes feminine. But with numbers, it's the opposite. With numbers, shalosh is feminine, and arba is feminine. Shlosha with the hey at the end is masculine. Arba'ah with the hey at the end is also masculine. Now, normally we find in most circumstances when the Mishnah lists things, it uses the masculine terminology. So that's why this seems out of place. The Gemara asks, why does the Mishnah say that she's niknes bishalosh drachim in 3 ways, in using a feminine term? We always find that the Mishnah, and Tosa seems to imply the Torah as well, always uses masculine numbers. So why are we using the feminine language for the numbers here? So the Gemara says, because it wants to say the word derech 3 ways, and the derech lashon nekevahu, and the word derech is a feminine word, right? Every word in Hebrew is either masculine or feminine. Derech, way, is feminine terminology, and so the number that modifies it is also feminine. Dersiv, as the pasuk says, v'hodata lahem es haderech yelchu ba. The pasuk says in Parshas Yisro, it says you should tell them the derech, the way that they should go upon, and it says yelchu va. Va on it is a feminine term, so we see the word derech is feminine. That's why, since it says shalosh drachim 3 ways, that's why 3 is feminine, because it's modifying the word derech, which is feminine. But what about the Bryce? It's actually a Mishnah, it should say Ditnan. The Mishnah in Mishnah Zavin, where it says B'shiva derachim in 7 ways, Botkin es hazav, we check the zav. There it uses a masculine term with the word derachim. It says b'shiva, shiva with a hey at the end. We said numbers when they have a hey are masculine. So there, even though it's derachim, it's derech, it's ways, the number that modifies it is masculine. How come? Now the context there is a zav. A zav is a man who has certain kinds of emissions that make him tameh. However, those emissions, if they are brought upon by certain causes, they don't make him tameh. So we have to check, we have to investigate what the cause of those emissions are to determine whether he is tameh, whether he's ritually impure, like a zav. That's the context over there. We'll come back to that. It's going to be important shortly. But the first question is, linguistically, why does it use the masculine terminology there for drachim if derech is in fact feminine? Nisni Sheva. Let it say Sheva, which is the feminine. So the Gemara says, Mishum dekabayu lemisni derech. I'll tell you why, because it's going to use the word derech, ways. V'ashkecha derech dikri lashon zachar. And actually derech, we find, is a masculine term. Even though we just said it's a feminine term, now we're saying it's a masculine term. Tichsiv, because the pasuk says, B'derech echad yetzu elecha, u'b'shiva derachim yanusu lefanecha. The pasuk says that if you follow the Torah, if you follow the mitzvos, so your enemies will come out b'derech echad, in one path, and then they'll flee b'shiva derachim, 7 ways they will flee from you, and there it's using the masculine numbers. You see, derachim and derech are in fact masculine terms, and the correct way to modify them with numbers is with masculine numbers. So the Gemara now points out the obvious. So we have a contradiction here. If so, we have a contradiction of verses and we have a contradiction of mishnahs, because we have one verse that seems to say that derech is a feminine word, and we have another verse that seems to say that derech, way, is masculine. And we have 2 mishnahs that follow those. We have a mishnah that says that our mishnah uses feminine terminology to modify derachim, and the Mishnah in Zavim uses masculine terminology to modify Zavim. So which one is it? So the Gemara explains, Kraya hadadi lo kashi. No, the verses are not a contradiction. Hacha de betorakai. The first verse was talking about the Torah. It said, the way that they should go upon. That's talking about the Torah. Derech there is referencing the Torah. The Torah ikri lashon nekeva, and the Torah itself is nekeva, is a feminine term. Dichsiv, as the verse says, Torahs Hashem tamima meshivas nafesh, that the Torah of Hashem is tamima, is perfect. Meshivas nafesh, it's settling to the soul. But there in that verse, Torahs Hashem tamima is all feminine. It's modifying the word Torah with feminine terminology. We see the word Torah itself is used in the feminine sense. So therefore, that verse, Kasav Labalashon Nekeva. So there, the word derech, which was referring to the Torah, was used in a language of Nekeva. That's in Parshas Yisro. That it was used in feminine terminology. But the other verse in Devarim, where it says that they will come out in one path, in one way, and then they'll flee in 7 ways. Hasam de milchamakai, there it's talking about war. So who are the ones coming out to war? The darka shel ish lasos milchama, the ain darka shel isha lasos milchama. It's normal for men to wage war. It's not normal for women to wage war. So kasav labalashon zachar. Therefore, it used a language of masculine, because even though the word milchama, Tosfos points out, itself is feminine, but there it was talking about the ones going out to war, not the war itself. It was saying B'shiva drachim b'derech echad yetzu elecha. In one path they will go out, and they're talking about the people will go out on the path. Therefore, in the context of those people going out on the path, those people are men. It used the male terminology for derech, or it modified the word derech with male terminology, with male modification. So that's why in that verse it uses the masculine. So that resolves the contradiction in verses. Now, how do the Mishnahs determine which of those 2 options to go with, masculine or feminine? So mastising adadi lo kashing. Also, the Mishnahs are not a contradiction. Our Mishnah is talking about a woman, how a woman is acquired in 3 ways. So it uses the language, 3 ways that a woman's acquired. It uses the feminine language to modify ways. Shlosha, b'shalosh, 3 ways, and uses the feminine, because it's talking about a woman. Hasam delgabe ishkai, there in the Mishnah in Zavin, it's talking about men. De darko shel ish libadik, ein darko shel ish libadik. Because even though there is such thing as a zava, a woman can also become tameh through certain kinds of emissions, but the difference is, da'isha nami ba'ones mitama. A woman, it doesn't matter how her emissions come, even if they are ba'ones, even if they are brought on by certain forced ways, she still becomes a zava, and therefore there's no checking how There's no investigation of how they came about. So that Mishnah is only talking about a male Zav who needs to investigate how the emissions came in order to determine his status. So therefore it's talking about a Zav, a masculine. So therefore Tani Lashon Zachar. Therefore it used a masculine language. For Drachim it said Shiva Drachim in the masculine. Okay, we're going to hold here and we're going to continue to investigate the language of these Mishnayos next time. Thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you next week.